The screech of tires against wet asphalt cut through the darkness as David Chen slammed his delivery truck to a halt. Steam poured from under the hood while rain hammered against his windshield, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear what sounded like someone running through the woods. He'd been driving this mountain route for 3 years, delivering fresh produce to the luxury resorts scattered across the Colorado Rockies, but he'd never heard anything like the desperate footsteps echoing through the pine trees at 2 in the morning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. David killed the engine and stepped into the downpour, his work boots splashing through puddles as he moved toward the tree line. The beam of his phone's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but branches and shadows. Then he heard it again, not just footsteps, but sobbing. Raw, desperate crying that made his chest tighten with recognition. He'd heard that sound before, 3 years ago, when he'd held his 5-year-old daughter Mia as she asked why Mommy wasn't coming home from the hospital. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Are you hurt?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by the kind of silence that screamed of someone trying very hard not to breathe. David took a few more steps into the woods, his flashlight sweeping across the undergrowth. That's when he saw her. A figure huddled behind a massive oak tree, wearing what appeared to be a white silk robe that was now soaked through and clinging to her shivering frame. She looked up at him with eyes that held the kind of desperation he'd only seen in war documentaries, wide and terrified, but trying desperately to maintain some semblance of control. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, and mascara ran in black streaks down her cheeks, but even in the harsh light of his phone, he could see she was beautiful in that polished, expensive way that usually made him feel invisible. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "please don't tell them you saw me." David felt his heart rate spike. This wasn't just someone who'd gotten lost hiking. This was someone running from something. Or someone. His military training from his brief stint in the National Guard kicked in, assessing the situation with automatic precision. Woman, mid-20s, obviously wealthy based on the quality of the robe, alone in the mountains at 2 a.m., terrified of being found. The math wasn't complicated, and none of the equations he could think of ended well. "Who's looking for you?" he asked gently, the same tone he used when Mia had nightmares. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was salvation or another threat. Finally she spoke, her words tumbling out in a rush. "My wedding. I was supposed to get married tonight, but it's not real. It's just business, just contracts and stock options and merger agreements. I couldn't do it. I couldn't say those vows knowing they meant nothing." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a single father who'd give anything to have someone to love again, and he'd found a woman running away from a wedding. But something in her voice, in the way she clutched that robe-like armor, told him there was more to this story than cold feet. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to her level. "Elena," she said after a pause. "Elena Castillo." The name hit him like ice water. Elena Castillo, as in Castillo Industries, the tech empire that had basically built half of Denver. He'd seen her picture in business magazines at the dentist's office, always in sharp suits, with that confident smile that said she could buy and sell entire companies before lunch. Seeing her now, vulnerable and scared in a soggy robe, was like discovering Superman worked at a gas station. David's mind raced as he processed what he was looking at. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Elena Castillo, the woman whose company's software probably ran half the devices in his apartment, was hiding behind a tree in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning. The same woman who'd been featured on Forbes covers for revolutionizing cloud computing before she turned 25 was now shivering in the rain, mascara streaming down her face like war paint. "Miss Castillo," he said carefully, "you're about 15 miles from the nearest town, and my truck just broke down. We need to get you somewhere warm before you freeze to death." She looked at him with suspicion, as if warmth might be a trap. "How do I know you're not one of them? How do I know you won't just call my father or Richard and tell them where I am?" Richard. David didn't follow business news religiously, but even he knew about Richard Morrison, the pharmaceutical heir who'd been photographed with Elena at charity galas for the past 6 months. The merger of Castillo Industries and Morrison Pharmaceuticals had been front-page news in the Denver Post for weeks. "Because," David said, pulling off his jacket and holding it out to her, "I'm nobody. I deliver vegetables to rich people's hotels, I drive a 15-year-old truck that just died, and the most important person in my life is a 5-year-old who thinks chicken nuggets are a food group. I've got no reason to care about corporate mergers or stock prices." Elena stared at the jacket for a moment before taking it, her fingers brushing his as she pulled it around her shoulders. The jacket swallowed her small frame, making her look even younger and more vulnerable. "Thank you," she whispered, and something in her voice suggested she hadn't said those words in a genuine context for a very long time. David stood up, scanning the area with his flashlight. "There's a ranger station about 2 miles down the road. It's probably locked, but there's a covered porch and some emergency supplies. We can wait there until morning, figure out your next move." "What about your truck?" "What about it? It's not going anywhere tonight, and neither are we." He looked down at her bare feet, noting the cuts from running through the woods. "Can you walk 2 miles? Elena followed his gaze to her feet and winced. "I don't have much choice, do I?" "Actually, you do." David surprised himself by saying it. "I could call someone. Your family, your fiancé. They'd probably send a helicopter or something." For a moment, Elena's composure cracked completely. Her face crumpled, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold the pieces together. "That's just it," she said, her voice breaking. "They would send a helicopter. They'd sweep in with lawyers and doctors and handlers, and they'd patch me up and put me back in that dress and march me down that aisle like a trained circus animal. Because that's all I am to them. A business asset with a pulse." David felt something twist in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since Mia was born. This woman had everything he'd never have: money, power, influence. But she was more trapped than he'd ever been. "Then we walk," he said simply. The trek to the ranger station took nearly an hour. Elena's bare feet were bleeding by the time they reached the small wooden building, and David had to half-carry her the last quarter-mile. The porch was dry, and there was indeed an emergency kit with blankets and basic first aid supplies. As David cleaned and bandaged Elena's feet by the light of his phone, she told him about the wedding that wasn't really a wedding. How her father had arranged the whole thing to secure a pharmaceutical distribution deal worth billions. How Richard had proposed with a ring that cost more than most people's houses but couldn't remember how she liked her coffee. How she'd stood in the bridal suite, looking at herself in that designer gown, and realized she was about to trade her life for stock options. "So you ran," David said, wrapping the last bandage around her ankle. "So I ran," she confirmed. "In my bathrobe, no less." Very dignified exit for a Fortune 500 CEO. David looked at her, really looked at her, in the dim light. Without the makeup and designer clothes, without the corporate armor, she looked almost ordinary, almost like someone he might actually know. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think running away in a bathrobe shows more courage than most people have in a lifetime." Elena stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "Courage? I abandoned my responsibilities. I humiliated my family. I probably tanked our stock price just by disappearing." "You chose yourself," David said quietly. "That's not abandonment. That's survival." Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of uncertainty. David woke to find Elena already awake, sitting on the edge of the porch with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the valley below. She'd somehow managed to tame her hair into a makeshift braid, and in the morning light, wrapped in his oversized jacket, she looked less like a corporate powerhouse, and more like someone's younger sister who'd gotten caught in the rain. "Sleep at all?" he asked, stretching the kinks out of his back from sleeping on wooden planks. "CEOs don't sleep," she replied automatically, then caught herself. "Sorry." Old habit. Corporate speak dies hard. David studied her profile, noting the dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with smudged mascara. When's the last time you actually slept? Really slept, not just passed out from exhaustion. Elena considered this with the seriousness of someone calculating quarterly projections. I honestly can't remember. There's always another meeting, another crisis, another fire to put out. Sleep feels like luxury I can't afford. That's not sustainable. Nothing about my life is sustainable, she said with a bitter laugh. That's why I'm sitting on a ranger station porch in a bathrobe instead of cutting my honeymoon cake. David's phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who watched Mia when he worked night shifts. Mia was asking when Daddy would be home and could she have pancakes for breakfast. The normalcy of it felt surreal against the backdrop of his current situation. I need to call my daughter, he said. Let her know I'm okay. Elena turned to look at him fully for the first time that morning. How old is she? 5. Her name's Mia. David pulled up a photo on his phone, unable to suppress the smile that always came when he talked about his little girl. She's probably the only person on Earth who thinks delivering produce is the coolest job ever. Elena studied the photo with an intensity that surprised him. Mia was grinning at the camera, missing her 2 front teeth, holding up a drawing she'd made of a truck with Daddy, written in purple crayon across the side. She's beautiful, Elena said softly. She looks happy. She is happy. Most of the time. David pocketed the phone. Kids are good at finding joy in simple things. Adults forget how to do that. I never learned how to do that, Elena corrected. My childhood was board meetings and etiquette lessons and being groomed to take over the company. I had tutors instead of friends, networking events instead of birthday parties. David felt a familiar tug in his chest, the same one he'd felt when Mia came home from kindergarten and told him about kids who had swimming pools and vacation houses. The difference was, Elena seemed to understand what she'd missed, while those other kids just expected more. What would you have wanted to do? He asked. If you could have been anything. Elena was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she said, a teacher, elementary school, maybe. I wanted to help kids learn to read. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Ridiculous, right? All that money spent on business school so I could fantasize about reading picture books to 6-year-olds. It's not ridiculous. That's human. Elena looked at him as if he'd said something profound instead of obvious. You're different than I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Most people, when they find out who I am, they want something. A job, an investment, a connection. They start talking differently, acting differently. You're just talking to me like I'm a person. David shrugged. You are a person who happens to be sitting on a porch in a bathrobe, but still a person. Elena's phone, which had been silent all night, suddenly exploded with activity. Text after text, call after call, the screen lighting up like a slot machine. She watched it with the expression of someone watching a snake coil to strike. 37 missed calls from my father, she reported. 14 from Richard. 23 from my assistant. And apparently the wedding planner has threatened to sue for emotional distress. Are you going to answer? I should. But she made no move toward the phone. The longer I wait, the worse this gets. Stock prices, media speculation, legal ramifications. I'm probably costing the company millions just by sitting here. David watched her face cycle through expressions like she was running calculations. This was CEO Elena emerging, the woman who carried the weight of a billion-dollar empire on her shoulders. But underneath, he could still see the scared woman from the night before. What's the worst that happens if you don't go back? He asked. My father disowns me. The board votes me out. The merger falls through, and we lose the pharmaceutical distribution deal. Richard sues for breach of contract. The media has a field day. Our competitors circle like vultures. She recited it like a grocery list, clinical and detached. And the best that happens if you do go back? Elena was quiet for a moment. I marry a man I don't love, spend the rest of my life in boardrooms and charity galas, and die knowing I never once chose my own path. Sounds like the worst-case scenario either way. Except one way, I only destroy my own life. The other way, I destroy thousands of jobs, shareholders, my family's legacy. David understood the weight of responsibility. He'd felt it every day since becoming a single father, knowing that every decision affected not just him but Mia's future. But this was different. This was a woman who'd been taught to set herself on fire to keep other people warm. "You know what I learned when my wife died?" he said quietly. "I learned that you can't save everyone. You can't protect everyone from consequences or disappointment or even failure. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is save yourself first." Elena's phone rang again, and this time she picked it up. "Hello, Dad." Even from several feet away, David could hear the shouting. Elena held the phone away from her ear as her father's voice exploded through the speaker, a rapid-fire barrage of accusations and demands. When he finally paused for breath, Elena spoke. "I'm safe," she said calmly. "I'm not hurt, I'm not kidnapped, and I'm not having a nervous breakdown. I just need time to think." More shouting. David caught fragments about family obligations and stock prices, and how Elena was being selfish and irresponsible. "Dad?" Elena interrupted, her voice taking on an edge that David imagined had silenced many boardrooms. "I will come home when I'm ready. Until then, you can tell the media that I'm taking a brief personal retreat to prepare for the transition. Richard can wait. The board can wait. The world will not end because I took 48 hours to think about my life." She hung up before her father could respond and immediately turned the phone off. "That felt terrifying and amazing," she said, her hands shaking slightly. "First time you've ever hung up on him?" "First time I've ever hung up on anyone in my life. I was taught that was rude." David laughed. Sometimes rude is exactly what the situation calls for. They spent the morning walking down the mountain toward town, Elena's borrowed jacket rolled up at the sleeves, and her bare feet in his spare work socks. She moved differently than she had the night before, less like someone fleeing and more like someone exploring. She asked questions about everything, the trees, the wildlife, the small towns they passed through. David realized she'd probably never just walked anywhere without a destination and agenda. When they reached Pine Valley, population 847, according to the weathered sign, Elena stared at it like she'd discovered an alien civilization. The main street consisted of a diner, a gas station, a hardware store, and a small grocery where David usually made his deliveries. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. "This is where you live?" Elena asked. 20 minutes down the road. Similar setup, though. David pointed toward the diner. "Betty's makes the best pie in 3 counties. And before you ask, no, they don't have a corporate account or a sommelier." Elena looked nervous for the first time since they'd started walking. "I don't think I know how to eat at a place like this. It's not complicated. You sit down, someone brings you food, you eat it. But what if they recognize me? What if they have questions?" David looked at her, really looked at her. Disheveled hair, no makeup, wearing his work clothes and socks, she looked nothing like the polished executive from magazine covers. "Trust me, you're not recognizable right now." Betty's diner was exactly what Elena had expected and nothing like she'd prepared for. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and the kind of coffee that came in thick white mugs with no saucers. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and kind eyes, looked at Elena's outfit without judgment and simply asked if she wanted coffee. "Yes, please," Elena said, then added, "Thank you." The waitress smiled. "Rough night, honey?" Elena glanced at David, who nodded encouragingly. "Something like that." "Well, coffee fixes most things. And what it doesn't fix, pie will." As they sat across from each other in a booth that had probably been there since the 1970s, Elena began to understand what David meant about simple things. The coffee was just coffee, but it was hot and strong and served without ceremony. The menu was laminated and offered exactly 12 options, none of which required explanation or interpretation. "I don't know how to do this," Elena admitted as the waitress walked away with their order. "Do what?" "Just exist." without an agenda or a strategy or a desired outcome. I've been planning my next move since I was 7 years old. Sitting here, not knowing what happens next, it's terrifying. David wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, studying her face. Maybe that's the point. Maybe not knowing what happens next is where life actually begins. Elena stared at him across the table. This man who'd found her in the woods and hadn't asked for anything in return, who talked to her like she was worth saving even when she wasn't sure she was worth the effort. For the first time in her adult life, she had absolutely no idea what she was supposed to do next. And for the first time in her adult life, that felt like freedom instead of failure. David's phone rang as they finished their second cup of coffee at Betty's, the harsh electronic sound cutting through the diner's comfortable murmur. The caller ID made his stomach drop. Pine Valley Elementary School. He answered immediately, his heart rate spiking the way it always did when schools called parents during work hours. Mr. Chen? This is Principal Martinez. I'm calling about Mia. What happened? Is she hurt? David was already standing, fishing for his wallet with his free hand while Elena watched with growing concern. She's not injured, but she's very upset. She's been asking for you all morning, and when we told her you weren't available, she had what I can only describe as a panic attack. She's in my office now, but she won't stop crying. She keeps saying something happened to you like it happened to Mommy. David closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of single parenthood settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Mia had been in therapy for 2 years, working through the trauma of losing her mother, but sometimes the fear still overwhelmed her small world. When Daddy was supposed to be home and wasn't, her 5-year-old mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. I'll be right there, he said. 20 minutes. David, wait. Elena reached across the table to touch his arm as he ended the call. What's wrong? My daughter. She's having a rough day at school. I need to go get her. He pulled out a $20 bill and left it on the table. More than enough to cover their simple breakfast. I can drop you somewhere first. There's a bus station in Brewster, about 15 minutes from here. Elena stared at him. A bus station? Unless you want to call your father. The suggestion hung between them like a challenge. Elena could see David's internal struggle, could see him torn between helping her and getting to his daughter. The responsible thing, the smart thing, would be to call her father and get out of his life before she complicated it further. Can I come with you? She asked instead. David paused, his hand on the booth's vinyl seat. To my daughter's school? I know it's weird, I know I'm a stranger, but I don't want to get on a bus and pretend yesterday never happened. And you helped me when you didn't have to. Maybe I can help somehow. David looked at her sitting there in his oversized jacket, her hair still damp from the rain, her feet in his work socks. She looked nothing like the polished executive who probably had nannies and boarding schools in her background. But something in her voice, a genuine desire to be useful rather than protected, made him nod. Okay, but elementary schools aren't like corporate boardrooms. 5-year-olds don't respond to quarterly projections and strategic initiatives. Elena managed a small smile. I'll try to remember that. The drive to Pine Valley Elementary took them through winding mountain roads that David could navigate with his eyes closed. Elena sat quietly in the passenger seat of Mrs. Garcia's borrowed pickup truck, studying the landscape like she was memorizing it. She'd never been in a vehicle that old, never sat on seats that were worn soft by years of use, never heard an engine that made reassuring mechanical sounds instead of the silent hum of luxury cars. Tell me about Mia, she said as they pulled into the school parking lot. She's brilliant, reads at a 3rd grade level already, obsessed with ocean animals even though we live in the mountains. She wants to be a marine biologist when she grows up, specifically to study whales. David's voice softened the way it always did when he talked about his daughter. But she's also scared. When her mom died, she learned that people you love can disappear without warning. Sometimes that fear gets bigger than she is. Elena absorbed this information with the focus she usually reserved for market analysis. What helps when she gets scared? Routine, predictability, knowing exactly where I am and when I'll be back, which is why disappearing overnight probably triggered every anxiety she has. They walked through the school's front doors into a world of colorful bulletin boards and the faint smell of crayons and disinfectant. Elena had never been inside an elementary school, had been educated by private tutors until she was old enough for prep school. The energy was different here, chaotic and joyful and utterly foreign to her controlled upbringing. Principal Martinez met them in the hallway, a woman in her 50s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades managing both children and their parents. She glanced curiously at Elena but was too professional to ask questions. "She's calmed down some," she told David, "but she won't talk to anyone except Mrs. Patterson, and she keeps asking to call you." Through the office window, they could see Mia curled in a chair that was too big for her, clutching a stuffed whale that David recognized as her comfort object. Her dark hair was in pigtails that had come loose during her crying, and her school uniform was wrinkled from where she'd pressed herself into the corner of the chair. "Can I go in?" David asked. "Of course. But maybe your friend should wait out here. We don't want to overwhelm her with strangers." David looked at Elena, expecting her to nod and step back. Instead, she surprised him. "What if I'm not a stranger?" she said quietly. "What if I'm Daddy's friend who knows about whales?" Principal Martinez raised an eyebrow. "You know about marine biology?" "I know about being scared," Elena said simply. "And I know a few things about whales." Something in her tone must have convinced the principal, because she nodded toward the office door. "Gently?" "She's been through enough today." David entered first, dropping to his knees beside Mia's chair. "Hey, baby. Daddy's here." Mia launched herself into his arms with the force of a small hurricane, her thin arms wrapping around his neck as she buried her face in his shoulder. "You didn't come home," she whispered against his shirt. "Mrs. Rodriguez said you were working, but you didn't come home, and I thought maybe you went to heaven like Mommy." David felt his heart crack open. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. My truck broke down in the mountains, and I couldn't call until this morning." "I should have had Mrs. Rodriguez explain better. You're not going to heaven? Not for a very long time, I promise." Mia pulled back to look at his face, her dark eyes still shiny with tears. That's when she noticed Elena standing quietly by the door, and her expression shifted to curiosity rather than fear. "Who's that?" she asked in the stage whisper that 5-year-olds believed was subtle. "This is Elena," David said. "She was stuck in the mountains too." "Elena, this is my daughter Mia." Elena stepped forward carefully, the way David had seen people approach nervous animals. "Hi, Mia. Your dad told me you know a lot about whales." Mia studied Elena with the intense focus children reserved for determining whether adults were worth their time. "I know about all ocean animals. But whales are the best because they're the biggest and they sing to each other." "Did you know that blue whales have hearts as big as small cars?" Elena asked, settling into a chair across from Mia. "And their hearts beat so slowly that you could climb inside the chambers between beats." Mia's eyes widened. "Really? Really? And humpback whales can hold their breath for up to 90 minutes. That's longer than most movies." "How do you know that?" Mia asked, her fear temporarily forgotten in the face of new whale facts. Elena glanced at David before answering. "I read a lot, and I've always thought whales were fascinating, but I never had anyone to talk about them with." For the next 20 minutes, Elena and Mia discussed whale migration patterns, whale songs, and the difference between baleen and toothed whales. David watched in amazement as this woman who claimed to know nothing about children engaged his daughter with genuine interest and respect. Elena didn't talk down to Mia or oversimplify concepts. She treated the 5-year-old like a fellow researcher, asking questions and building on Mia's knowledge. "Elena," Mia said suddenly, "why are you wearing Daddy's jacket?" Elena looked down at herself as if she'd forgotten her unusual outfit. "Well, I was caught in the rain last night, and your daddy was kind enough to help me." "Daddy helps everyone," Mia said matter-of-factly. "That's why he's the best daddy in the world." Elena looked at David with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I can see that." The crisis passed as quickly as it had begun. Mia decided she felt well enough to go back to class, especially after Elena promised to look up more whale facts to share with her later. As they walked back to the truck, David realized something fundamental had shifted in the past hour. "Thank you," he said as they drove away from the school. "I've never seen her calm down that fast with someone she just met." "She's remarkable," Elena said, and David could hear genuine affection in her voice. "When I was her age, I was memorizing profit margins and learning to shake hands properly. She gets to be excited about whales and trusts that the adults in her life will keep her safe." "Is that what you wanted when you were 5? Elena was quiet for a long moment. "I wanted someone to read me bedtime stories. My nanny used to, but my father found out and fired her. He said bedtime stories were a waste of time that could be better spent on educational activities." David felt anger rise in his chest, hot and protective. Not just for Elena, but for the 5-year-old girl she'd been, denied something as simple as stories before sleep. "That's not education," he said quietly. "That's just cruelty dressed up as preparation." Elena turned to look at him, and David saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression. No one's ever called it that before. They drove in comfortable silence until Elena's phone, which she'd forgotten was turned off, suddenly buzzed back to life with the accumulated weight of a day's worth of missed communications. The screen lit up with notifications, and Elena stared at it like it was a bomb about to explode. 63 missed calls, she reported. 47 text messages. And apparently, I'm trending on social media. "What are they saying?" Elena scrolled through the messages with growing alarm. "Missing CEO presumed kidnapped. Stock prices plummeting. FBI involvement requested. Oh, and apparently someone leaked photos from the wedding venue showing the abandoned bridal suite." She looked up at David with panic in her eyes. "They think I've been abducted. They're treating this like a criminal investigation." David pulled over to the side of the road, his mind racing. This had gone far beyond a runaway bride situation. If federal agencies were involved, if her disappearance was being treated as a potential crime, then his helping her could be misinterpreted in ways that could destroy his life and Mia's future. "Elena," he said carefully, "you need to call them, now, before this gets any worse." "I know," she whispered, but she made no move toward the phone. "I know I should call, should go back, should fix this mess I've created. But David, I can't. I can't go back to being that person who exists for other people's expectations. Yesterday, for the first time in my life, I chose something for myself. And today, I got to talk about whales with your daughter like it mattered. Like I mattered, not as a CEO or a merger opportunity, but just as a person." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "If I call them now, all of this disappears. I become Elena Castillo again, with all the obligations and responsibilities, and complete lack of choice that comes with that name. And you become a complication that needs to be managed and contained." David understood. He'd felt the same way after Sarah died, when well-meaning family members wanted to take Mia because they thought a single father couldn't handle raising a daughter alone. The fear of losing the life you'd built, even when that life was imperfect, was paralyzing. But as he looked at Elena, this brilliant broken woman who'd stumbled into his world and somehow made it richer, he realized something that terrified him. He didn't want her to disappear either. And that realization changed everything. The knock on David's apartment door came at 6:30 that evening, sharp and authoritative in a way that immediately put him on edge. Through the peephole, he could see 2 figures in dark suits, their posture screaming federal agents even before they held up their badges. Elena, who had been helping Mia with her homework at the kitchen table, went pale at the sound. "Elena Castillo," the taller agent said when David opened the door. "We're with the FBI. We have reason to believe you may have information about her whereabouts." David's mouth went dry. "I'm not sure I understand." "May we come in?" The second agent, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, was already looking past David into the apartment. "This is a federal investigation into a potential kidnapping." Elena appeared in the living room doorway, still wearing David's clothes but having somehow managed to clean herself up enough to look less like a refugee and more like someone playing dress-up. "There's been no kidnapping," she said quietly. "I'm Elena Castillo." The agent's reaction was immediate and telling. Relief, confusion, and something that looked like annoyance crossed their faces in rapid succession. The woman stepped forward, her hand moving instinctively toward her radio. "Miss Castillo, we need to get you to safety immediately. Are you injured? Have you been harmed in any way?" "I'm fine," Elena said, but David could see her walls going back up, the corporate mask sliding into place. "No one has harmed me. I left voluntarily." "Ma'am, your family reported you missing over 24 hours ago. There are extensive resources being deployed to locate you. We need to contact your security team and your family immediately." David watched Elena's transformation with a sick feeling in his stomach. The woman who had laughed with his daughter about whale hearts was disappearing, replaced by the CEO who knew how to handle crisis situations with clinical detachment. "Of course," Elena said smoothly. "I apologize for the confusion. I needed some time to think and I didn't realize it would be interpreted as an emergency situation." The male agent was already on his radio, reporting Elena's location and status. David caught fragments about helicopters and security teams and estimated arrival times. In the kitchen, he could hear Mia asking Mrs. Rodriguez, who had come over to watch her, why there were police at their house. "Miss Castillo," the female agent said, "we'll need you to come with us immediately. Your father and fiancé are extremely concerned, and there are media and security considerations that need to be addressed." Elena nodded, but David saw her hands trembling slightly. "I understand. Just give me a moment to collect my things." She walked past David toward the bedroom where she'd been staying, and he followed. Leaving the agents in the living room, Elena was moving mechanically, gathering the few items she'd accumulated, her face a careful blank. "You don't have to go," David said quietly. Elena stopped, her back to him. "Yes, I do. This was always temporary. I knew that." "Did you?" "Because yesterday you said you couldn't go back to being that person." "Yesterday I was being dramatic." Elena turned to face him, and David could see the effort it took to maintain her composure. "This is reality. I have responsibilities, obligations. I can't just disappear because I'm having second thoughts about my life choices." David stepped closer, lowering his voice so the agents couldn't hear. "What about Mia? You promised her more whale facts." For a moment, Elena's mask slipped, and David saw the pain underneath. "Mia will be fine. She has you, and that's more than most kids get. I'm just the stranger who helped with homework one day." "You know that's not true." Elena looked at him with eyes that held too much sadness for someone who just turned 30. "David, I live in a world where marriages are business mergers, and friendships are networking opportunities. You and Mia, you're real. You love each other without conditions or contracts. I can't bring my world into yours. It would destroy everything good about it. What if you stayed in our world instead?" Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And do what? I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. I don't know how to exist without the company, without the purpose it gives me. I'd just be another rich woman playing at normal life until the novelty wore off." "Miss Castillo," the female agent appeared in the doorway. "We really need to go. Your helicopter will be here in 10 minutes. Elena nodded and picked up David's jacket, which she'd been wearing like armor for the past day and a half. She held it out to him, and when he took it, their fingers touched briefly. "Thank you," she said, and David knew she was thanking him for more than just the jacket. For everything. The helicopter landed in the school parking lot, its rotors whipping the evening air into a frenzy that sent dust and debris flying. David watched from his apartment window as Elena walked across the lot, flanked by agents and newly arrived security personnel. She looked small and isolated in the center of all that protection, like a prisoner being escorted rather than a person being rescued. Mia pressed her face against the window beside him. "Where is Elena going, Daddy?" "Back to her family," David said, his throat tight. "But she didn't say goodbye." David picked up his daughter, holding her close as the helicopter lifted off, carrying Elena back to her gilded cage. "Sometimes grown-ups have to leave quickly, baby, but that doesn't mean they don't care." Over the next 3 days, Elena's return dominated the news cycle. The official story was that she'd needed a brief personal retreat before her wedding and had been staying at a private retreat center that had poor cell service, explaining the communication blackout. The wedding was rescheduled for the following month, giving everyone time to prepare for what the media was calling the merger of the century. David tried to go back to his normal routine, but everything felt off-kilter. His apartment seemed too quiet, his conversations with Mia too ordinary. He'd gotten used to Elena's presence, to her questions about his work, and her genuine interest in Mia's enthusiastic explanations of marine biology. Without her, his life felt smaller somehow, like a room with all the windows closed. Mia asked about Elena every day for a week. When would she visit again? Could they send her new whale facts? Did Elena have her own little girl to tell whale stories to? David answered as best he could, but how do you explain to a 5-year-old that some people come into your life like shooting stars, brilliant and brief and gone before you can make a wish? The knock on his door the following Saturday was different, softer, hesitant. David opened it to find Elena standing in his hallway, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, looking more like the woman he'd found in the woods than the CEO from the news reports. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi yourself." David stepped back to let her in, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. "I thought you'd be planning a wedding." "I called it off." Elena's words came out in a rush. "The wedding, the merger, all of it. I told my father and Richard that I couldn't go through with it, that I needed to make my own choices for once in my life." David stared at her. "And they accepted that?" Elena laughed, and this time there was humor in it, tinged with exhaustion and relief. "God, no. There was shouting and threats and lawyers. Richard's family is suing for breach of contract. My father's barely speaking to me. The board is in chaos, and our stock price dropped 12% in one day." "Then why are you here?" Elena looked at him with eyes that held something David hadn't seen before. Hope, maybe, or determination. "Because Mia asked me a question that I couldn't stop thinking about. She asked if I had my own little girl to tell whale stories to. And I realized that I've spent my whole life building something that would outlast me, but I've never built anything that would matter to me while I'm still here to enjoy it." She took a step closer. "I want to try something different. I want to see if I can learn to be the kind of person who reads bedtime stories and helps with homework, and cares more about whale facts than quarterly reports." "Elena." David's voice was gentle but cautious. "That's a beautiful thought, but you can't build a life on rebellion. Eventually, the novelty wears off, and you're left with the reality of what normal life actually looks like." "Then let me find out what that reality looks like." Elena reached for his hands. "I know I'm asking for something impossible. I know I don't fit into your world, and you probably don't want the complications that come with mine. But David, for the first time in my life, I met someone who saw me as more than a business opportunity. And I want to see what happens if I try to become the person you saw." From the kitchen came the sound of Mia's delighted squeal. "Elena, you came back! Daddy, Elena came back!" David looked down at his daughter, who was bouncing with excitement, then back at Elena, who was watching Mia with wonder and something that looked like love. "The question is," David said quietly, "are you ready for what comes next? Because this isn't a retreat you can leave when things get complicated. This is real life, with real consequences and real responsibility." Elena smiled, and David saw the woman who had climbed down from a helicopter and walked away from a billion-dollar empire. "I've been running toward responsibility my whole life. Maybe it's time I ran towards something that actually matters." Mia tugged on Elena's sweater. "Did you bring more whale facts? And can you stay for dinner? Daddy makes really good spaghetti, but he burns the garlic bread sometimes." Elena knelt down to Mia's level, her expression serious. "I brought whale facts, and I'd love to stay for dinner. But Mia, if I stay, it means I want to be part of your family. Is that okay with you?" Mia considered this with 5-year-old solemnity. "Will you help me with my science project about dolphins?" "I would love to help you with your science project." "And will you read me bedtime stories?" Elena's voice caught slightly. "Every night, if you want me to." Mia threw her arms around Elena's neck. "Then yes, you can be part of our family, but you have to promise not to go away in helicopters anymore." Elena looked up at David over Mia's head, her eyes bright with tears and possibility. "I promise. No more helicopters." David reached down to help them both up, and for the first time since Elena had walked back into his life, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could actually work. 2 years later, David stood in the kitchen of their new house, watching through the window as Elena and Mia worked together in the garden. Elena was teaching Mia how to plant tomatoes, both of them covered in dirt and laughing at something only they understood. The sight still caught him off guard sometimes, this life they'd built together against all odds. Elena had kept her promise. She'd stepped down as CEO of Castillo Industries, selling her shares and using the money to start a foundation focused on early childhood literacy. She worked from home 3 days a week, spent Fridays volunteering at Mia's school, and had never once complained about the dramatic reduction in her income or status. The transition hadn't been smooth. Elena's father had disowned her publicly, claiming she'd destroyed the family legacy for a, quote, temporary infatuation. The media had painted her as everything from a feminist hero to a cautionary tale about women making emotional decisions. Some days, Elena struggled with the weight of what she'd given up, questioning whether she'd made the right choice. But then Mia would ask for help with her homework. Or David would find Elena reading marine biology books because she wanted to answer Mia's increasingly complex questions, and he'd see the contentment in her eyes. She'd traded power for purpose, influence for intimacy, and the exchange had transformed her into someone David barely recognized from those first desperate hours in the mountains. "Daddy, come see," Mia called from the garden. "Elena taught me how to make the plants happy." David stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, breathing in the scent of fresh earth and possibility. Elena looked up at him with soil streaked across her cheek and pure joy radiating from her face. "We're creating an ecosystem," she explained seriously. "Mia's idea. The tomatoes help the basil keeps away bugs, and the marigolds protect everything. It's called companion planting," Mia added with authority. Elena looked it up in 3 different books to make sure we got it right. David knelt beside them, marveling at how Elena approached even gardening with the same thoroughness she'd once applied to corporate strategy. "Looks like you two have everything under control." "Almost everything." Elena wiped her hands on her jeans and pulled a small velvet box from her pocket. "There's one more thing we need to plant to make our ecosystem complete." David's breath caught as Elena opened the box to reveal a simple gold band. "Elena, I know we said we didn't need official papers to make this real," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "But Mia and I were talking, and we decided we want the same last name. We want to be a real family, legally and officially and completely." Mia bounced beside them. "I helped pick out the ring." "Elena said you don't like fancy things, so we got you a plain one." "But it's still pretty." David looked at these 2 females who had become his entire world, Elena with her dirt-stained clothes and radiant smile, Mia with her gap-toothed grin and absolute confidence that this was how families were supposed to work. "Elena Chen has a nice sound to it," he said finally, taking the ring from her trembling fingers. "Is that a yes?" Elena asked. Instead of answering with words, David slipped the ring onto his finger and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like soil and sunshine and everything good he'd never expected to find. Mia cheered and threw a handful of dirt in the air like confetti, declaring it the best proposal ever. 6 months later, they stood in Betty's diner in Pine Valley, the same place where Elena had first learned to order coffee without an agenda. Betty herself had offered to cater their small wedding reception, insisting that anyone who'd brought that much happiness to her regular customers deserved her best pie. Elena wore a simple white dress from a department store, her hair loose around her shoulders, no designer, anything in sight. David had never seen anything more beautiful. Mia stood between them as their witness, wearing a flower crown she'd made herself and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers they'd picked that morning. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" asked Judge Martinez, Principal Martinez's husband, who'd agreed to perform the ceremony. "I do," David said, thinking about all the ways Elena had surprised him, all the walls she'd torn down to become the mother Mia deserved, and the partner he'd never dared hope for. "Do you take this man to be your husband?" Elena looked at David with eyes that held no shadows of her former life, no regrets for the empire she'd abandoned. "I do. Completely and forever." When they kissed, sealing their unlikely union, Mia declared loudly that now they could finally get a dog, since Elena had promised that married people were more responsible pet owners. Elena laughed against David's lips. Did I really say that? You did, Mia confirmed. I have it written down. As they drove home through the mountains where their story had begun, Elena reached for David's hand. Any regrets? She asked quietly. David thought about his old life. Simple and predictable and safe. Then he looked in the rearview mirror at Mia, who was explaining to her stuffed whale why weddings were important for families, and at Elena, who was listening with the same attention she'd once given to board meetings. Just one, he said. Elena's face fell. What? I regret that it took a broken-down truck and a runaway bride for me to find you. Elena smiled, squeezing his hand. Maybe that's how the best love stories work. They start with disasters and end with forever. In the back seat, Mia was already planning their future, talking about the dog they'd get and the bigger garden they'd need and how Elena could teach her whole class about whales. David listened to his girls chattering about tomorrow and next week and next year, and realized that sometimes the most extraordinary life began with the simplest choice to help a stranger in the rain. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.